how to lay siege to a samurai castle in the late Sengoku period. Man, interesting. I didn't think they would have, I don't know what it's called in English, but the ditch with water around it. I kind of picture that as more of a Western castle kind of design style, by Sound Roman History.
Siege warfare in Japan differed fundamentally from that in Europe. While European sieges were revolutionized at the end of the Middle Ages by the emergence of artillery and bastion forts, guns and siege engines played only a minor role in Japan. Instead, Japanese armies often favored direct assault tactics to capture fortresses. Japanese castles were also designed with a different defensive approach in mind. Rather than relying on a massive outer wall to stop the enemy as in Europe, Japanese defenses were based on the principle
As I would say, the walls always seem pretty low.
Of defense in depth. Attackers were forced to navigate a carefully engineered labyrinth of death, where defenders launched counterattacks, ambushes, and rained down stones, arrows, and bullets. The second half of the 16th century witnessed numerous spectacular sieges.
Look at this design. I mean, the castle part in the middle itself is almost like on a Venice-like island. I mean, that's interesting.
During which fortresses were burned, undermined, or even deliberately flooded. In this video, we explore how to lay siege to a Japanese castle during the Sengoku period. The Onin War broke out in Japan in 1467. Its most significant clashes occurred in and around the then capital, Kyoto, where allegedly over 200,000 fighters from two rival clans engaged in what can be best described as a massive street battle that lasted more than a decade. By the war's end, Kyoto was in ruins, and so was the authority of the emperor. The political and social order collapsed, plunging Japan into chaos. Soon, dozens of rival lords, known as daimyo, competed for power. During this period, known as the Sengoku, or Warring States period, political legitimacy was based...
Which, there's something funny that I always kind of knew, but Mark Elf, one of the big commenters on the channel, elaborated recently, is that in Japan, one of the expressions that people use about everything is that everything is the Sengoku, the Warring State. So like there's the idle Sengoku period and this and that Sengoku period, because it just works, right? Like it's when there's a lot of fighting, a lot of variety,
solely on military strength. To consolidate their positions, the more ambitious lords began constructing vast networks of fortifications. According to some estimates, nearly 40,000 castles of various sizes were built during the Sengoku period. Amid the struggle for power, these small strongholds changed hands regularly, making siege warfare more important in Japanese warfare than ever before. When we talk about Japanese castles during the Sengoku period, we are not referring to grand iconic structures like the Himeji castle. These impressive architectural symbols of wealth and authority only began to appear during the more tranquil years following 1600 under the Tokugawa shogunate. Until the mid-16th century, most Japanese castles were what is known as yamashiro, simple mountain fortresses made of wood and earth. A key principle of Japanese military architecture.
So a castle is maybe it's still accurate, right? But when we think of castle, we think of Western castle, right? This giant stone walls and, the big drawbridge and the water and the guard towers and, all that, right? But I guess, this is I guess it's probably still called the castle, but it feels so different in concept.
Was that a castle's strength lay not in the way it was built, but in its location. Because of this, building sites were deliberately chosen for their lack of accessibility. In the case of Yamashiro, literally mountain castles. Two abundant natural resources in Japan were utilized: wood and mountains. These castles were literally built out of the mountain. First, one or more peaks were cleared and flattened to create plateaus. Then the mountain slopes were transformed into simple fortifications. Ditches were dug between individual hilltops and sometimes even filled with water by diverting mountain streams. The individual fortified areas were connected by bridges that could be dismantled or raised at a moment's notice. Finally, the felled wood was used to construct simple structures: palisades, gates, platforms, towers, and various residential and storage buildings. A reasonably well-preserved example of a Yamashiro is Takeda Castle. From the mid-16th century onward, wealthy daimyos began reinforcing the mountain slopes with layers of stones and replacing palisades and wooden walls with plastered, wattle and daub constructions, as seen in this case. This innovation addressed the greatest weakness of the Yamashiro, its instability, because the simple earthen foundations were prone to erosion and undercutting. They could only support small, lightweight structures. To solve this, builders covered the mountain flanks with a layer of pebbles before cladding them with solid dry stone walls. This gently sloping stone foundation enabled the construction of larger, sturdier buildings, laying the groundwork for the development of the traditional Japanese castles we know today. According to the historian Paul Varley, this innovation marked the beginning of, quote, the great age of castle building in Japan. The fortresses built in the second half of the century impressed European missionaries and merchant travelers who visited Japan. With their massive stone walls, these castles reminded them of the artillery fortresses common in Europe at the time, known as bastion forts or star forts. Their defining features were low, massive walls, with bastions designed to withstand.
Yeah, I've never actually seen something like this. I mean, I don't know if we had that many in France like this. You see castles all over the place. I used to live in the south, and again, like in my small village, I didn't have to go more than like 30 minutes before finding like a castle. I talked about it before, but there was like a city close to where I live where there was Roman ruins and a massive medieval castle ruins. I mean, ruins. Like the castle was still like, you know, there was a good amount of it. The Roman ruins were like just pillars and a little bit of like an auditorium maybe kind of place, but never actually, you know, came across like that kind of design. Usually it's just like the single castle atop a hill, you know.
Sustained cannon fire and eliminate any blind spots for the defenders' artillery. Sieges on these fortresses were waged with shovels and guns, and often ended when the city wall was breached. Now, while the walls of Japan's largest fortresses indeed resembled European bastions, their purpose was fundamentally different. In Japan, artillery played hardly any role in siege warfare. At most, an attacker brought a few catapults, and even these were primarily used as anti-personnel weapons, rather than to destroy walls and fortifications. According to Thomas Conlon, an expert on Japanese warfare, the Japanese quickly recognized the effectiveness of Western cannons, but it took considerable time before these weapons were fully integrated into their arsenal. It was not until the siege of Osaka in 1614 that bombardment tactics comparable to those in Europe were employed. Until then, Japanese commanders preferred to rely on mass infantry assaults, precisely the type of assault the fortresses of the period were designed to withstand. The evolution of Japanese siege tactic reminds us that every era develops its own form of strategic thinking. The same emphasis on positioning, timing, and intelligent command is at the heart of Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus, who we'd like to thank for sponsoring this video. What makes Tacticus great is not just the Warhammer setting, which I'm a fan of, but that it offers a fast-paced, turn-based gameplay that does require thinking ahead and using strategy. It's not one of those games which plays itself. If you do not position your characters well enough, or if you don't have the right team comp, you're not going to succeed. Tacticus' like gameplay cycle of unlocking progression and achievement is rewarding because it allows you to customize your forces and deploy increasingly powerful units with unique abilities, each with their own specific traits and strategy. Currently, there are more than 90 champions from 20 playable factions available. On top of the PvE campaigns, such as the Fall of Cadia, there are also PvP live events and guild raids, and an ever-expanding roster of factions and champions. While you can play and enjoy Tacticus for free, there are in-game paid unlocks available, which often come with a regular discount, and which I found can be worthwhile if you're wanting those later campaigns right from the get-go, or if you wish to play as a certain faction from the very beginning, ready to take the battle to the Warhammer universe. Use the QR code on screen, click the links down below, and join Tacticus today. The tactical principle underlying Japanese castles was defense in depth. Unlike European artillery fortresses designed to stop an attacker at an impregnable outer line of defense, Japanese castles were not meant to halt the enemy at a single barrier.
Yeah.
Instead, they consisted of multiple levels, sometimes referred to as tiers, that attackers had to conquer one by one. The defenders...
Which obviously I'm not going to talk like I know anything, but just guessing, looking at the design right here, like, it actually makes a lot more sense. For all the archers, for example, defending the castle, it's probably hard to hit anyone when they're like all spread out outside. But if you let them get into one of the small walled parts, and you can just get on the wall, like it's much easier to target them, right? So it's kind of like bottling them up. That makes a lot of sense.
would confront them, retreat strategically, and then counterattack to slowly wear them down. If the defense held, the enemy was routed before reaching the castle's heart. So, unlike with European fortresses, battles were fought not only in front of the walls, but also within the castle itself. The principle of defense in depth wasn't limited to individual castles, it also shaped castle building on a strategic level. Apart from their main strongholds, the daimyos built dozens of smaller satellite castles scattered across their territories. These formed a web of obstacles, forcing an invading army to engage with multiple fortified points. Hence, the intruder had to conquer or destroy every single fortress in its path.
Which sounds like such a pain, right? I mean, you've got like all those tiny, not very important castles, but at the same time, it's like, if you put it under siege, you need a lot of men to do that. You can't ignore it because then the guys on there can eventually come back behind you. And if you attack, sure, it's not the craziest castle, but it's still like casualties. So yeah, it's really like a system of slow attrition of forces, right? Of the advancing army. Yeah, and then they eventually have to get to the big castle.
Otherwise, the garrisons could later strike at their supply lines from behind. A single small border castle might not stop an invader, but it drained resources, tied down soldiers, and cost precious time. Multiply that by dozens of such castles, and even the most determined advance could be slowed or even brought to a halt. A famous example of such a castle network is the fortresses of the influential Hojo clan. Their main castle was in Odawara at Sagami Bay. As the clan's largest and most prominent fortress, Odawara stood at the head of a sprawling network of satellite castles, most of which were controlled by family members. These satellites operated independently in day-to-day affairs, but coordinated closely with Odawara to manage and defend the clan's territory. One of the most important first-rank satellites was Yamanaka Castle, which was attacked by Toyotomi Hideyoshi in 1590 and overrun in a single day. Beneath these first-rank satellites were sub-satellites, typically small mountain castles, and finally, at the outer edge of the Hojo territory, basic outposts, torides, which served primarily as rallying points for local troops. Such networks could expand to include dozens of castles, forming a complex and deeply layered system of regional defense. Another key difference between Japanese and European fortress architecture was that Japanese castles served almost exclusively military purposes. Unlike the fortress cities of Europe and China, which combined military, economic, and civilian functions, Japan had no such multi-purpose strongholds until the late 16th century. Japanese castles primarily functioned as defensive strongholds and administrative centers rather than as shelters for the broader population. As time went on, fewer and fewer daimyos concentrated power in their own hands. They expanded their territories and raised ever larger...
Like in a way, I don't know if that's a good or bad thing, like in a way, it's only the army people fighting. There's no civilian around, So there's a lot less civilian deaths compared to some of the European siege, right? Where like, the population starve or is caught in the fighting, and that's pretty terrible, yeah.
Armies. Most traditional Yamashiro were too small as rallying points for thousands or even tens of thousands of troops. As a result, starting in the 1570s, warlords began to move into the plains, where they constructed new fortresses that not only served their military needs, but also showcased their authority and wealth. Alongside the modernized mountain castles, two new types rose to prominence: the Hirajiro, or plain castle, built on flat terrain and surrounded by moats and earthen ramparts, and the Hirayamajiro, a hilltop castle constructed on a hill within a...
Kind of a random thought, but I wonder what is the strongest castle in human history, yeah? Like there must be one castle in one country that was built in such a perfect defensive manner that, it's gonna attack many times but never actually defeated or something. It's probably one that's like at the top of a perfect mountain where, you know, you have only one road to get to it. And then the entrance to it is like this crazy wall, and it's like impregnable, and it's like too small of a road to bring any kind of siege artillery or siege weapon or anything. It's probably something like that, yeah.
Plane. One of the earliest representations of this new, functional and representative generation of castles was Atsuki Castle, built by Oda Nobunaga, the first of Japan's great unifiers in 1576. Commanding structures like Atsuki became the stages for some of the most spectacular sieges of the Sengoku period. There was no single blueprint for Japanese castles. They came in many forms and shapes.
Man, this film makes me want to play Mountain Blade. Like one of the Japanese one, I think it was Gekijo maybe. Though I guess now there's Mountain Blade too, but you know, I don't know if there's Japanese conversion mode for that one.
Molded by their surrounding landscapes and the needs of their owners. Yet despite their differences, they shared one crucial feature. All were built on the principle of defense in depth. Every fortress was divided into multiple baileys or courtyards, which attackers had to capture one by one. This shared structure allows us to define an ideal type, a simplified model that brings together the key defensive features common to many castles of the late Sengoku period. In very simple terms, the castles of this period typically consisted of the main bailey, surrounded by several outer bailies. The most common layouts were the ring style, the compound style, and the stepped style, which was usually built on or next to a hill. Since asymmetrically arranged hill forts were most common in the late 16th century, our ideal type is the Hirayamajiro in the Teikakushiki or stepped style. The centerpiece of such a castle was the keep, or tenshu, which stood prominently in the main bailey. Up to 7 stories high, it towered over the entire complex.
Looks amazing
It
too.
could be seen for miles. The tenshu served multiple purposes. It was an elevated lookout, a symbol of the daimyo's power, a secure storage area, and most importantly, the final stronghold in case of attack. The baileys were arranged like steps, each with a stone wall forming the front, topped by a wattle and daub wall, featuring embrasures, triangular for firearms and rectangular for bows. Just behind these walls, rows of trees shielded defenders from incoming projectiles. In the event of a prolonged siege, these could be used as fire and building materials. At key points, such as corners, towers reinforced the walls, further strengthening the defense. The baileys were connected by stairs and paths, forming a labyrinth of walls and gates that both visitors and intruders had to navigate to reach the main bailey. An outstandingly complex example of this is Himeji Castle. Built somewhat later, it presented attackers with the daunting task of passing through 21 gates before reaching the heart of the fortress. Some of these were virtually impassable. The strongest gatehouses functioned like sluices. Attackers entered a small courtyard through a first gate, which was then closed behind.
I guess now I think about it, I've experienced this in the game Samurai Warriors, yeah. The Dynasty Warriors spin-off based on the, you know, usually the Sengoku era of Japan. And now that I think about it, yeah, some of the castle siege missions are kind of like this, where like you have to one by one clear like one of these baileys as he called it, and then open a gate or something, continue to another one, defeat the commander, clear the troops. So, yeah. I've experienced that in a game, so it's not quite the same level of harshness, right? Dynasty Warriors is really, you know, easy. It's just one swing kills 100 people, right? But yeah, I guess I experienced that a bit in that game.
Before they could proceed through a second gate. This system gave defenders precise control over who was allowed inside. The outermost line of defense was a moat, which either held water or, as in our example, featured the distinctive tatami-like network of ridges and gorges.
That was kind of
crazy.
crazy.
The architecture of such a fortress was geared towards neutralizing the attacker's most significant advantage, his numerical superiority. Narrow, winding paths and cleverly placed obstacles forced invaders to break into smaller groups, making them easy targets for the garrison, which was poised to strike quickly and unexpectedly. The defenders relied on their mobility, using ambushes, lunges, and sudden counterattacks to devastating effect. Familiar with every inch of the castle and its surroundings, they held a tremendous advantage over the invading force. Despite their many differences, Japanese castles shared several key features with European fortresses. Both acted as force multipliers, allowing small garrisons to hold off vastly superior enemy forces, or at least inflict heavy losses on them. Attacking even a small castle required immense manpower, time, and resources, which is why Japanese commanders avoided sieges whenever possible. They were considered exhausting, costly, and risky. As a result, most attacks on fortified places began with negotiations. Once the attackers had surrounded the castle, the leaders of both sides would meet to seek a diplomatic solution. Only when talks failed would battle break out.
Wouldn't talk fail most of the time?
It was already clear that the defenders had no chance. Attackers often overran them outright. For example, Takeda Nobutora, father of the famous Takeda Shingen, is said to have destroyed 36 castles in a single day. Even if most of these were small outposts that were burned down or surrendered quickly, and the accounts are exaggerated, this remains an impressive feat. When the attacker lacked clear superiority, or a direct infantry assault was impossible for other reasons, commanders had a range of elaborate but effective alternatives to fall back on. The first step was to transform the encirclement into a complete siege line. This was one of the stages of a siege that closely resembles Western methods, where attackers gradually advanced a network of trenches toward a fortress while their artillery provided cover. In Japan, the siege line served as a launching for further operations and was extended as needed. To create elevated positions for their archers, attackers built artificial mounds or constructed towers, some of which were even mounted on wheels. Unlike Western siege towers, however, there is no evidence that they were used to scale walls. Instead, they provided elevated platforms for arquebusiers and archers to suppress the defenders' fire. This allowed their comrades to move forward to fill in trenches, build ramps, or erect advanced breastworks. As they progressed, the attackers protected themselves against projectiles with various mobile walls and shields. For example, the so-called tate, the Japanese equivalent of European pavises. The siege of Otsu in October of 1600 demonstrated just how decisive establishing a solid siege line and methodical advance could be. Otsu was a fujo, a fortified complex near a river or lake that had piers and was situated on Lake Biba, Japan's largest freshwater lake. The castle stretched across several islands, connected to the shore only by 4 heavily defended bridges. According to contemporary reports, to work around this obstacle, the attackers began filling in the outermost moat with a small battery on a nearby hill providing covering fire. Unfortunately, nothing is known about these guns beyond their existence. Nevertheless, Otsu was among the first sieges in Japan to see the use of modern black powder artillery. The attackers' tactics proved effective. Once they reached the outer bailey, they quickly captured it, and it was only a matter of days before the defenders surrendered. One man who frequently conducted elaborate siege operations was Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the second great unifier of Japan. Some of the most spectacular sieges in Japanese history unfolded under his command. Generals like him had an extensive strategic arsenal at their disposal, including, but not limited to, assaults, bribery, arson, and impressive engineering feats. Deep mining, for example, falls into this latter category. This labor-intensive method involved digging tunnels to collapse walls and buildings, or create a subterranean passage directly into the fortress's interior. For example, when Hideyoshi besieged Itami Castle in 1574, he ordered his troops to dig a long tunnel from outside the wall into the innermost bailey. After several weeks of hard and dangerous labor, they broke through near the keep, and the castle soon fell. Unlike in Western sieges, however, there is no evidence of mine warfare in Japan, meaning defenders did not dig countermines or engage in underground battles. Even more spectacular was flooding. The use of water as a weapon is famously associated with the Netherlands, where vast areas were deliberately flooded to repel besieging armies. For example, during the siege of Leiden, the forces of the Dutch Republic
even though it's kind of later, when I think of it, I think of Chiang Kai-shek ordering the flooding of big parts of China to stop the Japanese invasion in World War II. And how that totally didn't work, but killed a massive amount of people, right? That's what I think of flooding in warfare.
Half the province of Holland to force the Spanish to retreat. In Japan, however, it was usually the attackers who harnessed water as a strategic tool. A striking example is Toyotomi Hideyoshi's siege of Takamatsu in 1582. Nestled in a swampy area between two hills, Takamatsu was considered nearly impregnable. Undeterred, Hideyoshi hired hundreds of workers to construct a massive 3-kilometer dam to gradually raise the water level of the surrounding swamp. When the rainy season arrived, Takamatsu quickly became an isolated island in a vast artificial lake. Hideyoshi again demonstrated the devastating power of water in siege warfare during the sieges of Ota in 1585 and Oshi in 1590. If all else failed, attackers had to resort to the slowest but most reliable tactic: starvation. Since castles rarely housed large numbers of civilians, defenders could often hold out for months or even years, making it equally likely that the besiegers would run out of supplies first. To avoid this, the sieging armies often expanded their siege lines into a network of forts and castles surrounding the besieged town. This allowed them to maintain the siege without having to keep and supply a massive force on the ground. Still, starving a garrison was a slow and uncertain tactic. Cutting off their water supply proved far more effective. During the siege of Chokochi Castle in 1570, for example, the Rokaku clan managed to destroy the aqueduct that fed the castle's well. Immediately realizing the direness of the situation, the commander of the defenders, Shibata Katsuie, ordered the destruction of all other supplies and led his men in a death-defying final counterattack. Against all odds, the assault succeeded, forcing the Rokaku forces to retreat. From that day on, Shibata was known as Shibata, Devil Shibata. All in all, long sieges were rare in Japan. Between 1512 and 1614, only 29 sieges lasted more than a month. The longest by far was Oda Nobunaga's attack on Ishiyama Hongenji, the main fortress of the Ikko-Ikki sect, which dragged on for almost 11 years. The scarcity of prolonged engagements reflects a clear preference. Japanese commanders generally avoided drawn-out sieges. Instead,
I don't know what's the longest siege in history. I think in some video about the Venetian Republic, I think I remember about one siege in a tiny island. There was another siege by the Ottoman Empire. Well, I think it was the Ottoman Empire, yeah. I think it was like a 20 or 30 year siege or something, because it was still an island, so I guess to an extent they were still like able to grow food and stuff like that. It wasn't a castle, it was an island, right? Yeah.
They favored swift, decisive assaults. Oda Nobunaga, for example, relied on direct infantry assaults in 70.5% of all his attacks on fortified places. And this was the most common approach among his contemporaries as well. The reasons were both cultural and practical. Samurai doctrine emphasized boldness and valor rather than patient attrition in the trenches. At the same time, logistical realities often demanded speed. Supplying an army deep in enemy territory was difficult. Relief forces could arrive at any moment, and many ashigaru, peasant infantrymen, were farmers who needed to return home in time for the harvest. In short, commanders had every incentive to bring sieges to a swift end. Direct assaults were an effective means to achieve this. Though they typically resulted in heavy casualties, they were highly efficient in terms of time and cost. In addition, they offered
cost of life is nothing against the cost of everything else, as always.
Glory, almost comparable to that of open field battle. For instance, the first warrior to enter a castle during a siege was referred to as the Ichiban Nori and earned immense prestige. So great was the honor that men literally competed to be the first to charge forward. However, the enthusiasm of the individual fighter and the frequent use of assaults should not obscure their inherent risks. Japanese castles were explicitly designed to resist this kind of frontal attack, which could make
I assume majority of the time the first guy in dies.
them a deadly gamble. When it came to the actual storm attack, the besieger would first identify the most favorable point of assault, often a weak spot in the defenses, or a dip in the terrain where archers could provide better cover. Once the direction was set and the troops stood ready, the assault began. The first obstacle the besiegers faced was the moat. As they struggled through the tatami-like network using ladders and large shields, the defenders unleashed a hail of stones, arrows, and arquebus fire. Meanwhile, the attackers as archers and arquebusiers returned fire, aiming to suppress the defenders and ignite the wooden buildings with flaming arrows and small grenades. Once the attackers crossed the moat, they reached the wall of the first bailey and immediately began to climb it. It was usually not very difficult, even without
Not very
ladders,
high,
as the
yeah.
sloped, dry stone walls offered plenty of footholds. However, castle architects anticipated this vulnerability. The keep or corner turrets and even upper wall sections featured openings called ishi or toshi, known as murder holes in
Murder
European
holes.
terminology, through which defenders could drop stones directly onto the climbers below. These openings resembled the gun ports of large ships and could be closed with a hatch. At the top of the wall, attackers encountered a row of metal spikes, which they had to climb around, while the defenders pounced them with a brutal but effective weapon known as wolf's teeth. These were massive wooden beams, sometimes studded with iron nails and suspended on ropes or chains, which were repeatedly dropped or swung along the wall, battering the climbers and causing severe injuries or sending them crashing to the ground. Entirely in accordance with their defense-in-depth tactics, the defenders aimed to inflict as many casualties as possible on the attackers at the outermost wall, but did not intend to stop them at all costs. Avoiding direct confrontation once the situation became precarious, they conducted a fighting retreat to the high ground of the second bailey, confronting the intruders with a series of skirmishes and ambushes. This was the genius of these fortresses' design. Sections that fell to the enemy could be isolated easily, allowing for counterattacks from secure positions. The defenders exploited this advantage, while the besiegers struggled to push through the hail of bullets to reach the second wall as quickly as possible. In doing so, they crossed the first threshold and entered a deadly network of defense in depth. One way to shorten this slow, bloody advance was through bribery and blackmail. During the siege of Fushimi Castle in 1600, one of the last decisive battles before the unification under the Tokugawa, their enemies tried to take Fushimi by storm. The attack began on the 27th of August, but soon stalled at the wall of the main bailey. Only when the besiegers took the defenders' family hostage and forced him to set fire to a tower did they break through and capture the castle. If no such opportunity arose, the attackers faced an even tougher climb, as the walls of the second bailey were usually steeper than those of the first. In addition, the defenders took this stage of the retreat battle far more seriously. From above, they jabbed the climbing men with long spears and thrust them through small holes
It's still not
in the
that high of a
walls,
wall, no?
aiming for the climbers' unprotected bellies. They inflicted as much damage as they could, while still avoiding direct confrontation. Very much to the frustration of the attackers, who wanted to finally fight them, the defenders retreated again as soon as the first man climbed over the wall. The closer the invaders advanced toward the castle's heart, the fiercer the resistance grew. The second bailey was fortified with additional obstacles and elevated.
It's always interesting, like the duality of samurai tactics, right? Like on one side you have the, it's dishonorable to do anything but just face someone in battle, right? And on the other side you have like the more strategist samurai type like this, where again, the other type would probably look at this as very dishonorable, right? Like not face them directly, but slowly retreat, go behind a wall, stab them from the wall, retreat to the next wall. Like, it's really interesting the different view of the different side, I guess.
Positions, forcing attackers into narrow, designated paths. These confined routes split the invading force, rendering their numerical superiority useless. Instead, the defenders now held every advantage. Engaging in a kind of guerrilla warfare, they isolated small groups, struck with lightning speed, then vanished through gates or secret passages, only to reappear and strike elsewhere moments later. Reinforcements often arrived too late, finding nothing but the bodies of their slaughtered comrades. The winding paths.
Man, I don't know if any of you have played Kingdom Come Deliverance 1 and 2. They're incredibly historically accurate medieval game from, the Bohemian War, I guess, around that time, like 1500. And again, they're like such a fun, immersive, game as like, character in that time period, right? I wish there was a game of that quality based on like, I always say it, but like, not just this period of Japan, but, different period of history, right? Like the Three Kingdom era, because there's a lot of Three Kingdom game, but they tend to be Dynasty Warrior, right? Where, one swing kills hundreds of enemies or something. I wish there was like more games of that quality and that immersiveness and that level of care for the historical accuracy. You know, it's still a game, right? It's not like that real per se, but it's still like so well done. I mean, I'd always be cheating Kingdom Come Deliverance 1 and 2. They're just so freaking incredible. It's such a shame that in that genre, you know, all of the other like historically accurate game tends to be like very small indie, you know, text game or like a strategy game like Total War or something. And Kingdom Come Deliverance kind of stands alone, you know, as like this first person, ultra immersive historical simulator, basically. Yeah.
And courtyards became deadly traps, where attackers were ambushed or hit by precise volleys at any moment. If the attackers survived running the deadly gauntlet through the labyrinthine defenses, they faced the last challenge, the main bailey with the keep. Often seen as the final boss, the keep mimicked the outer defenses, with a maze of narrow hallways, loopholes, complex floor plans, and murder holes. Yet, in practical terms, it held limited military value. By the time the attackers reached the inner bailey, they rarely needed to capture the keep. It was much easier to set it ablaze, and in many cases, the defenders surrendered anyway, once the main bailey fell.
I see.
This was often their best hope of survival. Those who resisted too long risked harsh retribution. Still, some commanders, unwilling to yield castle and honor, led one final, desperate counterattack in defiance. Victory was unlikely and defeat certain.
Now that's the samurai way.
Honor was worth the cost.
Okay.
Don't forget to check out Tacticus. Build your squad.
That's it. Man, interesting. I actually never thought about it, but yeah, Japanese castles were very different. Huh? Again, I almost feel like, I don't know if, I mean, it is a castle, but, you know, my idea of castle is the Western castle, so it really feels like so unlike a castle, even though it is a castle. Yeah, I like the system though, the design. It's pretty interesting. I'm sure there's some Western castle who had like a bit of a system of like multiple line of retreat and bailies, as you call it, but it was definitely nothing like this. Yeah, really interesting. Again, my dream is like a Sengoku period game where, you know, with like actually realistic, yeah, like an immersive realistic game of that time period, right? As fun as something like Ghost of Tsushima is, you know, you can clear castles as a lone man, right? And it's not really it. Yeah, good stuff. I learned quite a bit from this. Yeah, I learned quite a bit. Very interesting video. Okay.